I'm on a journey to print, paint, or otherwise collect a miniature for every creature in the D&D Monster Manual, and today we have a new way of deciding what comes next. This wheel holds a small selection of the hundreds of miniatures we still have left to go, half of which have been determined at random, and the other half suggestions from Patreon members. So without further ado, the first mini we'll be tackling today is the Otyugh. Interesting. Ah yes, D&D's garbage disposal. I've always had a soft spot for these creatures. They're a pretty fun concept, but seriously, who comes up with this? The Otyugh is a large, bloated mass of thick hide, lumbering around on 3 stocky legs. Sprouting from its back is a writhing cluster of tentacles, many tipped with vicious spikes for shoveling food into its maw, while others end in the creature's otherwise inconspicuous eyes. Dominating its diseased body is a massive gaping mouth lined with rows of jagged teeth, easily large enough to swallow anything of even vaguely humanoid size. But adventurers aren't an Otyugh's usual meal. Instead, these creatures feast on whatever nobody else wants: rotting carcasses, offal left behind by other predators, and just about any other organic waste they can find. It's this appetite that has earned them a surprisingly practical place in some larger settlements, where they're kept beneath cities to dispose of refuse, or beneath gladiatorial arenas to clean up after the day's entertainment. Some D&D settings even describe the same relationship occurring naturally, with cave-dwelling creatures dropping scraps and waste into Otyugh lairs. So, wherever there's a steady supply of corpses, carrion, and filth, an Otyugh is sure to feel right at home.
Spending some time looking around my mini factory for an Otyugh design, I actually ended up settling on this supportless model by Rocket Pig Games. While it might not have the dozens of sharp teeth that the official artwork does, it still reads really well as an Otyugh. Being a support-free design, this printed up quite cleanly on my FDM printer. It just required a little bit of cleanup, carving some of the rougher overhangs away with a knife and then coming in with some files to clean them up. Since I don't think I'll be using the airbrush to paint this model, I decided to also just brush on the primer. I've been using this Kaleido Gloss Black that I really like. It fills in those last few layer lines and has a nice candy shell coating for FDM prints. Moving on to some colour, I decided to mix this rich brown with some black to get a really dark undercoat to build up from. I want this creature to feel like it has a thick, colourless hide, and I think that having some real contrast on it will help sell that effect. Then, I mixed some of that dark brown into an ochre yellow to create my first sort of mid-tone on this model. And I'm not going for super smooth blends here either, instead opting for some rather blocky chunks of colour to make sure that that darker brown base coat still shows through to give that contrast that I'm after. Moving on to what is quite a subdued highlight across the hide of this character, mixing that ochre yellow with some bone. This will help the overall model read a little bit closer to the colour we see in the official artworks without losing that dark undertone and contrast across the piece. For some of the smaller details across the piece, I came in first with a very, very dark grey across all of these toe nails, whatever you want to call them, then moved up through a mid-tone grey, and eventually some spot highlights with a light ash grey colour. For the teeth, to help make these fit in with the rest of the model, I used the same bone colour that I mixed in as the highlight for the skin, and then highlighted these up with some pure white mixed into that bone just to push them a little bit brighter than the skin tones. Now, moving on to the mouth. Of course, I wanted this part of the model to stand out because it is very much a focal point, so I came in with some very vibrant pinks, which definitely helps these parts of the model stand out against the more neutral palette of the rest of the mini. Building up from that more vibrant base coat, I then came in with some buffed hide for the highlights across these parts, which I made sure to blend a little bit more than I did the rest of the model, just to help it sell as a very different surface, trying to make it read as a little bit softer compared to the calloused hide of the creature's back. And then, once I was happy with how the mouth was reading against the rest of the model, it was time to move on to the base. For these bases, I wanted to go for an underground rocky feeling, so I used some of my Crystal Caverns bases from one of the old Patreon releases, painting these up with a dark grey, coming in with a black wash, and then highlighting them up with a few simple layers of dry brushing with some lighter and lighter greys. And then because these bases were feeling a little too similar in brightness to the mini itself, I came back in with another thinned down layer of wash just to add some of that contrast back in. And with that, our Otyughs are ready to hit the table.
With the Otyugh down, that is another miniature ticked off the list. But I do think that we have time for one more today, so let's go ahead and have another spin. Ooh, the Umber Hulk. But before we move on to our next miniature, if you are enjoying this video, do be sure to subscribe down below. And if you want to help support the channel, consider checking out the Painted for Combat Patreon, where for as little as $2, you'll get access to our awesome community Discord, all of my printer profiles and tools, and be able to have your say on what goes on the wheel next. Or at the higher tiers, get access to monthly STL packs of sculpted bases ready for FDM printing, like our release for August, the Winding Winds Spell Bases pack. Awesome windy bases that have flung rocky debris into the air, perfect for your wind-bending casters, airborne elementals, or other magically inclined minis. Of course, where possible, these bases have been sculpted with flat top faces to reduce unsightly layer lines, and as always, are designed to print completely support-free on FDM printers. So whether you want to join a like-minded community, pick up some awesome STLs, or just help support the channel, consider checking out the Painted for Combat Patreon with the links below. The Umber Hulk. Now, this is one of D&D's classic creatures. If you've spent enough time exploring dungeons, there's a good chance you've crossed paths with an Umber Hulk. Or at the very least, heard the horror stories. Towering over most adventurers, the Umber Hulk is an enormous insectoid brute. Like a beetle, has been cramped into the silhouette of a gorilla. Combining a hulking frame with massive digging claws, these creatures are capable of carving tunnels straight through solid rock. Its thick, chitinous armor makes it incredibly difficult to bring down, while a set of powerful mandibles are more than capable of turning an unfortunate adventurer into lunch. But none of that is what adventurers fear the most. It's the eyes. Staring directly into an Umber Hulk's gaze can leave creatures hopelessly disoriented, their minds overwhelmed by a strange hypnotic effect that scrambles their senses and leaves them stumbling around in confusion. It's a simple ability, but one that's ended more than a few dungeon expeditions. As you'd expect from a living, tunneling machine, Umber Hulks spend much of their lives beneath the earth, carving vast tunnel networks through mountains and the Underdark in search of food. While they're often solitary creatures, their tunnels have a habit of opening pathways to far more dangerous places, making an Umber Hulk encounter likely the beginning of a much bigger problem.
This model printed up great with some simple tree supports. The nice blocky shapes of the design really lent well to FDM printing here, and the supports came away super easy. The only issue that I had on this model was when taking the supports off of the head, one of the mandibles did happen to snap off. Luckily this was a pretty easy fix, just using some gel superglue to push it back into place. And this model printed up actually quite clean, just a tiny amount of filing on some of those more egregious overhangs, and it was ready to go. And after using some of that same gel superglue to put everything in its place, this model was ready for some paint. For this mini, I did want to create some slightly smoother gradients, so I decided to do most of this paint job with the airbrush. Regardless, this started with that same primer just through the airbrush. This is what it's designed for after all, it just happens to also work pretty well with a brush. And after that initial primer, I actually swapped my airbrush out to this Advanced Seeker by Gallery. They recently sent me this to have a play with, and I have to say I've been really impressed. The 0.3mm nozzle means I can get some reasonably high fidelity out of this airbrush without running the risk of it clogging, which is something I've had issues with 0.2mm airbrushes in the past. When I was sent this airbrush, they mentioned that it was aimed at beginners to be a sort of workhorse kind of a tool, and I definitely feel that. If you are interested in checking out any of Gallery's airbrushing tools, or the Kaleido Colorworks paint range that they have, which includes that primer you've seen me using, I'll leave my affiliate link down below. That'll just let Gallery know that I sent you, and if you do happen to pick anything up, not only will it give you a 10% discount, but it will kick a small amount of that sale back to help support the channel. To recap some of the painting you've been seeing here, I started with an all-over coat of dark brown, followed by a zenithal of this bone colour, focusing it on some of those armour panels on the creature's back. From here, I wanted to add a little bit of richness to this carapace. Using some speed paints through the airbrush, a mixture of a rich brown and a yellow, and I focused this mixture mostly in the shadows and crevices across the model, but did also give a reasonable coat across most of the mini, just to add some of that saturation across the model. And making the most of this airbrush, I used this to separate some of these armour panels on the creature's back. Then I came back in with that initial bone colour to push some of these highlights back up across the mini, before moving over to the paint table for some dry brushing. My main focus with this dry brush was to push the brightness up a little bit further, but also to capture all of the edges of these nicely segmented armor panels, to really help pull out some of the detail across this mini. And while this did work to an extent, I still decided to come in with a bit of actual brushwork after the fact, not only to push these edge highlights a bit further, but also watered down to add some interest to the carapace on the creature's back. And for our final detail of the eyes, these got a base coat of red followed by a dot of yellow. And finally for the base, I painted this up very similar to the Otyugh's one, but added a little bit of metallic paint on some of these crystals on the base. And with some glue, this model was ready to hit the shelf.
And there we have it. 2 more creatures printed, painted, and on the shelf. And I'm really happy with how both of these came out. Their paint jobs are a little different in style, but both are going to look amazing on the tabletop. Now, before we wrap things up, it's time to repopulate the wheel. As mentioned, half of the entries on the wheel are determined at random, but the other half come from Patreon suggestions. So if there is a particular creature that you'd like to see sooner rather than later, be sure to head on over to the Patreon and keep an eye out for the next suggestions post, and you just might see your entry appear on the wheel. But while we're here, we might as well see what we'll be tackling next time. Ooh, the Behair. That's going to be a fun one. But for now, thank you so much for watching, and as always, have a good one.